Okay, well, good morning. Actually, good afternoon, Gia, right? It's like 2 p.m. over there in Chicago.
What time is it for you?
It's 9 over here in Hawaii.
9.
Yeah,
Okay.
9 o'clock.
Yeah, it's 2. 2
Um,
p.m.
yeah. Thank you, Gia, for joining me. Me and Gia well, actually, we didn't meet at Garrett. We were both at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary at the same time, but then kind of had the pleasure of connecting afterwards, after I think a lot of people were like saying that we should, which was cool.
Yes.
Um, But Gia does a lot of really cool work in Chicago, and I actually want you, Gia, maybe if you could talk a little bit about that yourself. But before we get into that, maybe could you just share with us your name, where you call home, and then an ancestor that taught you about love.
Absolutely. So I'm a Jia Johnson. It's actually Jia Johnson. Jia is short for Legia. I picked it up in college and it just kind of stuck. But home, that's such a great question. I think I have a lot of different places that I would call home. I've done a lot of moving over the years, starting from when I graduated from high school. So I've lived in several different states and cities. So home, like my origin is El Paso, Texas. That's where my family is. It's where I go for the holidays and things of that nature. But I would also say that California is home for me too. I have a lot of chosen family, friends that I couldn't imagine doing life without. And we've just been friends for so long. So California is a place where I would call home. And then I would say Chicago is my new home, where I'm working on growing deeper roots here, and it's been really good being here in Chicago. Yeah. And then I think you asked me the other question, an ancestor?
Yeah, an ancestor that maybe taught you about love.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say my grandma. On my mom's side of the family, I spent summers with her. And she just loved us so much, and just like really just like cared for us. We cooked together. I remember when I would get sick, she would take care of me. I spent like she was like daycare for me when I was growing up. So I would definitely say that my grandma taught me a lot about how to love and be present for people.
Yeah,
Yeah, she's a sweet lady.
that's beautiful. Well, Gia, can you just maybe let people know a little bit about the work that you're doing? And I would also love to know kind of what motivates you or brings you into that work.
Absolutely. So I currently work for McCormick Theological Seminary, located in the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. And I direct their higher ed and jail program. It's called the Solidarity Building Initiative for Liberative Carceral Education. And it is a program of where we offer theological education to individuals who are detained in maximum security divisions at the Cook County Department of Corrections. And so the program really, it is a social justice, abolition, reentry program where we are looking at reentry as starting the moment that somebody is detained. And then you begin that process of building relationships and resourcing folks so that by the time that they leave incarceration, they have connections to the community, and they've had some skill development and resource connection. But the program is not just theological education. We also do public ed and advocacy, which is where you're enjoying that collaborative partnership that we have for the Abolition as Resurrection. And so that's part of our public ed and advocacy about like consciousness raising around these issues of mass incarceration. Then we also have a program called Reentry. It's our reentry support system. And it's just the seminary as a connector to these reentry pathways, working with SBI alum, getting them paired up with the coach to kind of help them navigate the reentry process. And then we have collaborative partnerships where we work with like local grassroots organizations, maybe other academic institutions, and do like some capacity building, resource sharing, network sharing in this work, and where we have like this mutual alignment around healing our wounded communities as well as ending incarceration.
That's beautiful. Gia, what brought you into that work or kind of motivates you to do that?
So I would definitely say it is it's lived experience. So I have a loved one who's currently incarcerated right now in a Texas prison. And so watching my loved one kind of navigate the carceral system at the pretrial level, this was many years ago. And then once they got out, just really watching how the stigmas and like the reentry barriers just really kind of suffocated any sense of like new beginning, desire for doing something different. I think it's also complicated. I think recidivism is really complicated, but from the outside looking in, just kind of watching that struggle, and then just coming to this realization in our most recent interaction with the carceral system is just recognizing that for your loved ones that are struggling with mental health or substance dependency, oftentimes the safest place for them is a carceral space. Because long-term quality healthcare, substance treatment services just aren't available for folks that don't reside on the right side of that like wealth line or class line, and that's a tragedy. Folks that need healthcare or to contend with substance dependency find themselves incarcerated as opposed to getting quality care and treatment. And so that's really been one of the catalysts for me around the work that I do. And then I would also say my faith. Jesus was a healer. Jesus was a revolutionary. Jesus was also a healer, and knew how to sit and be with people who had been harmed by systems of oppression. And I think that the resurrection, I think it is the new beginning. It is an ushering in of a new way of doing and being. It is the ushering in of beloved community. And so I think that justice is about flourishing. Justice is not about punishment. Justice is about flourishing. And so how do we work together individually and collectively to make our communities more just? And more just communities mean more flourishing communities where people have access to the resources and the relationships and the networks that they need to live into the fullness of their humanity and their purpose.
I love that. I love justice as flourishing, because that really sounds like it's kind of at the root of what's happening at SBI and the work that you're doing over there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, so my organization, Jia, is Faith Action. And so it's a lot of the member units are churches, and it's interfaith, but most of us are Christian churches. And on the podcast, one thing that I don't remember if it was you or someone else was kind of talking about is the church or Christianity's role in actually forming kind of our ideas around the carceral system. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and how those ideas come together.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I want to plug just some resources, some folks who have just kind of really helped my thinking in this area. But so Jenny McBride wrote a book called Radical Discipleship. Highly recommend that text. She has a section there where she talks about like the atonement theories and our need for kind of like redemptive punishment. Kaia Stern also has another book called Voices from American Prisons. It's this text right here. She has a chapter in here where she talks about just like the history of punishment and just the role that Christian education, religious education played in that construction. And then Dominique Gilliard has a really great book called Rethinking Incarceration, where I see you smiling. So these are probably familiar authors.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Where he has a book where he just, he talks a lot about that. And so the episode that you're talking about, I believe, is with Nakia Roberts. It's the second episode. And we asked her to help us understand atonement theories and how that's kind of played into carceral logic. So simply put, carceral logics is really just our socialization on systems of punishment and practices of punishment when harms have been created. And cancel culture is a form of carceral logic, right? And so that we have to isolate people, we need to use silence, we need to use revenge or retaliation in order to resolve our conflicts when somebody has been harmed. And so I think that what she talks about is, and this is what many of these authors are talking about as well, is that like our atonement theories that that there was need for violence and punishment in order for humanity to be redeemed, and that so God's wrath needed to be appeased. And so this comes back from like our early kind of like church fathers. And what's interesting too is that like they're interpreting their theology through the social and political landscape of their time. Right. And kind of trying to make sense of how do you understand that relationship between God and humanity. And so they were looking at kind of like the upper echelons and then like the peasants and just like the ways that like their power dynamics kind of work themselves out. And so that's part of what's influenced some of this interpretation that that there needs to be some sort of punishment in order for repair to take place, for restoration to happen. And so we see that we see that same kind of ideology and dynamics play themselves out in our carceral in the carceral system, right? And so like in the birth of the penitentiary here in the US, I think during the time of like 1770s, like early 1800s, there's this need for reform and like retribution and like rehabilitation. And so this idea that rehabilitation, that you can rehabilitate somebody's soul through bodily punishment. And so this was deeply connected to like Christian ideologies, Christian doctrine. There was a gentleman, and so some of these earlier carceral spaces were actually started by like some Quakers, to be honest, by people of the Christian tradition that wanted to kind of that had like an altruistic kind of motive behind it, but then it just went really south. And they became these really toxic, harmful places. But there was a gentleman named, his last name was Linz, and he was the warden for a place, penitentiary called Auburn State Penitentiary. And he was a Calvinist, and he had just like these really like dehumanizing ideologies around convicts as being cowards and unable of being reformed unless it was through like severe punishment. And so this is where you have like the use of like religious education, which was really used as a way to like indoctrinate and like manipulate incarcerated folks. And then you have like forced isolation. This is where you I think it was called like the congregant style of incarceration, where you have like this mixture of like prison labor and Bible study to kind of begin to like reform. But these were like really toxic. These sites became really, really toxic. But a lot of what Linz did, we still see it in our current carceral system, these same kind of practices. The other thing I want to note, which I think is really interesting too, is that like in the early construction, the primary demographic for prisons or penitentiaries was white men. Because if you think of during that time, you had chattel slavery, right? Like you had the forced removal of like indigenous people from their lands into like gosh, I'm losing my train of thought here. That what?
Did you say reservations?
Yes, that was the word I was looking for, reservations. And so the demographic was primarily like white men. And then when you have the Civil War and like the end of chattel slavery, that's when you start to see the demographic shift. But what's also interesting is that wardens during that time had talked about how reading and education was a way to reform these wayward souls. And that like education was that they were like, I can't remember, like I have it quoted in a paper I wrote, but where it's like they were like these filthy men, and then now they have this education, and so now they're like more sophisticated and like well-mannered, and so education, is like going to save the soul, right? But then when you have when you have these demographic shifts, then you bring back in the same practices and tools around like illiteracy and violence that you had in chattel slavery, because now the demographics have changed. And you literally have like wardens talking about where it's like, no, we like Black and brown bodies are not worthy of this, right? Like
Wow.
they're inhumane, right? They're animalistic. And so they don't have these tools. And so I want to make that statement, that because I think that higher, like, access to reading, access to education for anybody is life-changing and transformative, right? It's how you do it.
Mhm.
It's the purpose and the intent behind it. And so while the intent and the intention in the construction of the early penitentiary was one really of dehumanization, when you do use education or give people, when you look at education as a human right, it really is, it's not just transformative, but it also increases people's access to resources upon release from incarceration.
Yeah.
That was a lot.
No, thank you for the history this morning. I didn't realize that you were going to give us so much, but that really is a gift, I think, and helps us understand a lot of context. So thank you. I was curious, Jia, what kind of things are you learning yourself in kind of the practice and podcast of abolition as resurrection? Like, are there new things that are growing for you?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I'm gonna think back here for a second. All of the episodes were really special to me. Most of they're all friends, so they were really special episodes. But the episode that we did with Nakia, Michelle Day, and Gigi, the one around like everyday abolition, that's really what we were trying to get at, is like, how do we as individuals begin to become less reliant on carceral logics and more reliant on practices of like restorative justice? And how do we rethink the ways in which we talk to ourselves, right? I think we're living in a time right now where the harmful language that we use to in our own self-talk is also the harmful language that we use, that can also kind of translate into how we engage in interpersonal relationships, and then how we kind of like create institutional policies and practices, right? And so I think that abolition, it is definitely a system change, organizing tool, practical policy change, right? It is all of those things, but it is also, how are we as individuals being transformed and changed while we're doing the work? Because if not, we just continue to bolster the same systems. And so I'm really loving how in our abolition movement, like, you have so many folks talking about like abolition is a way of life. It should fundamentally change the way that you organize and live your life and form your relationships. I've been in a couple of different abolition spaces where we talk about that. And I love that was a part of our conversation in this podcast. I think the other thing that the other episode was the conversation with Alonzo Wahid and El Dowd around building deep community. And so, because we can't do this work alone, right? Like, as I'm an introvert, I live alone. I've traveled alone. Like, I spend a large part of my life alone. And you can only go alone for so long, right? Like, you have to have people. And so how do we build this deep community in such a way where when harms do happen, we can call each other? Right? Like, we can rely on one another to resolve these issues, so that we don't have to rely on police, like the policing system. And so that was just a really great conversation with Alonzo, and just the work that he's doing and with equity and transformation. They are a grassroots organization that's led by directly impacted people. And the work that they were doing during COVID, and just showing up in the hood, like in their neighborhood, and just being fully present with people, was just a really beautiful dialogue and conversation.
That's beautiful. Yeah, if that isn't church, I don't know what is. Just being
right?
people in their
church.
Yeah. Well, Jia, one of the things we're trying to do right now during Lent is kind of reimagine what would it look like for us to completely, I guess, abolish or reimagine public safety and community. So here in Hawaii, it takes like something like $219 a day to incarcerate one person. So it's like $80,000 a year almost just for one individual. And I'm just wondering, what things do you think we should invest in instead of these systems that are very violent and cause people a lot of harm? And not just like individuals, but obviously the communities as well. What are the places that you feel like we should be investing this money in instead?
Absolutely. So first, I would say investing money in organizations that are led by or predominantly, or where there's like a lot of representation of directly impacted people. I think that directly impacted people, they were closest to the problem, and they're going to be closest to the solutions. And so there's a lot, I know here, like there's a lot of directly impacted folks that are leading organizations, starting programs, that are at the helm of this movement. And so I think investing in those organizations would be key. And then I would also say too, investing in, so there's an article that I highly recommend. It's called Everyday Abolition. And I'm just going to read this quote that they have in here around non-reformist reforms, which are strategies that reduce the power and scope of the criminal justice system and reduce our reliance on it, while simultaneously building up our skills, capacity, and resources for alternative systems of preventing, addressing, and responding to harm. So any policies, programs that are less reliant on the criminal justice system and more reliant on like local based services that are going to address the underlying causes that create incarceration to begin with. Lack of access to housing, lack of access to jobs, lack of access to mental health and like substance abuse. So like job readiness training programs, things of that nature. Higher ed and prison programs, like that's a really, like, I mean, especially now that Pell Grants have been reinstated, there's like this movement, you know, to be able to offer more higher ed and prison programs. So I would suggest investing in those types of programs, but more local kind of community-based initiatives and organizations that are led and ran by folks who have been impacted by our criminal legal system would be a really great start.
Thank you, Jia. And thank you for including so many resources. I'll definitely try to link people to those things. So thank
Absolutely.
you. Any last things, Jia, that you want to share or this is stirred for you?
No, I just want to say that this is like, I'm really grateful and appreciative for the work that you all are doing and for engaging this conversation with me. And so, yeah, just thank you. And if I could be of service or support in the future, like feel free to reach out. I'm happy. I love collaborating and kind of brainstorming.
Yes. Yeah. It's good to collaborate always and work together. So thank you.